¿Qué es lo que, y'all? Estamos activos. Bienvenido. We're now una comunidad of more than 13,900 suscriptores. So big shout out to all y'all that have already subscribed. And if you haven't yet, come on with it. In a previous lección, we learned how to conjugate verbos regulares, regular verbs, in the present tense. If you haven't seen esa lección yet, I highly recommend backing up to that one first and then coming back to this one, because esa lección is key to understanding this one. So in esta lección, we're going to talk about how to conjugate los verbos irregulares. So let's get into it. In our regular present tense conjugation lesson, we learned that all regular verbs use these endings: o, as, a, amos, and an for verbs that end in ar. O, es, e, hemos, and en for verbs that end with er. And o, es, e, imos, and en for verbs that end in ir. But the thing about los verbos irregulares is that they don't always follow these rules. This can sometimes mean that the verb conjugates completely differently, sometimes following basically no rules, like ser, which we learned a few lessons back. The conjugations for ser are soy, eres, es, somos, and son. Without already knowing, there's no way to really look at these and tell A, that they come from ser, or B, that they're all related to each other. We're not talking about these kinds of verbos irregulares in esta lección, because there's literally nothing I can do to help you with these besides point them out. You just have to learn them with practice and repetition. But there are many irregular verbs that I can help you with, because many verbos irregulares still mostly follow the same rules as regular verbs, but with a slight difference. There are three types of verbos irregulares that I'm going to break down in esta lección. Verbs that are only irregular for yo, stem changing verbs, and verbs that follow both rules 1 and 2. Let's start with rule number 1. For some irregular verbs, only the yo form is irregular. So this can mean that the yo form gets a new letter or that one of the letters changes to a different one. Let's look at the verb poner, which means to put. The conjugations are pongo, pones, pone, ponemos, and ponen. Notice that all of these follow the regular rules. The endings are still o, es, e, hemos, and en because this verb ends in er. But yo is different. If this was a regular verb, it would be pono. But there's a he that's added, so we get pongo. This is what makes it irregular. Now let's look at the verb hacer, which means to make or to do. The conjugations for hacer are hago, haces, hace, hacemos, and hacen. Again, all of the endings are regular: o, es, e, hemos, en. But in the yo form, the se changes to he. So instead of it being hago, it's hago. Let's look at one more example for this rule by looking at the verb conocer, which means to be familiar with or to meet. The conjugations for conocer are conozco, conoces, conoce, conocemos, and conocen. Again, we still have the same regular endings: o, es, e, hemos, and en. But the yo form gets zeta added to it so that it's conozco. So rule number 1 is really easy because all of the regular conjugation rules still apply. The yo form is just a little different. So let's look at rule number 2. These verbs are called stem changing verbs because the first part of the verb, aka the stem, is what's going to have the changes that make it irregular. Here are a couple common stem changes that you'll see. and e might change to e or ie, like the verb pedir, which means to ask for or to order. The conjugations for pedir are pido, pides, pide, pedimos, and piden. Just like we saw with rule number 1, all of these endings are still the same as it would be for a regular verb ending in er. O, es, e, imos, and en. So what's different? Unlike what we saw with rule number 1, the change is happening at the beginning of the word, and it applies to all forms except nosotros. Nosotros always acts like a regular verb, but pido, pides, pide, and piden all have e at the beginning instead of e. Now let's look at the verb pensar, which means to think. The conjugations for pensar are pienso, piensas, piensa, pensamos, and piensan. Notice again, we still have o, as, a, amos, and an, which are all the regular endings for verbs ending with ar. What's different is that the first e changes to ie for every form except nosotros, because as we learned, nosotros always acts as a regular verb. You'll also see that some verbs that have o or u in the stem change to ue, like the verb dormir, which means to sleep. The conjugations are duermo, duermes, duerme, dormimos, and duermen. You still see the same endings, o, es, e, imos, and en, because this is a verb that ends in er, and those are all the regular endings. But the stems change from o to ue in every form except nosotros, because nosotros always acts regular. The very last rule we're going to talk about is rule number 3, which are verbs that follow both rules number 1 and 2. These verbs are different in the yo form, and the other forms except nosotros also have a change in the beginning part of the word. Like tener, which means to have. The conjugations are tengo, so the go for yo, then tienes, tiene, and tienen all have the e to ie change, and tenemos is just like a regular verb. So that's everything in this lesson to help you better understand how irregular verbs work in the present tense in Spanish. Gracias por estar aquí. Hasta la próxima.